Hello, Steve. Welcome to the
Hello.
show.
Thank you, Dr. Miriam. It's lovely to be here.
Dr. Steve, Dr.
I
Mary.
know. Well, doctor's in the house. Nerd.
Yay. Okay, so now it's clear for the audience that we are smart, so now we can be just ourselves.
Silly fun. Yes.
Awesome. Looking forward to talk about inclusivity, inclusive leadership, maybe a little bit of business building. I'm very fascinated by what you have built.
Thank you.
And before we get there, I always start with the same question. When did you start calling yourself a facilitator? And actually, do you?
I do. Facilitator, coach, guide. And I started my facilitation career actually doing software training.
Mm,
So I was a software facilitator. Well, actually, then I was a trainer, I would more so say. But and I really enjoyed it. I was very good at it. I knew the software. And then I went and studied leadership as my part of my master's degree. And then I started getting all these started doing work in more in the soft skills arena. And I think
mm.
that's the moment when I shifted from being a trainer to being a facilitator.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, a trainer to me is, step one, do this, step two, do that, step three, do this. And of course, there's shades of both in both conversations. But a facilitator to me was guiding folks through the content where a trainer's telling people how to go through the content. If that, it's a
Mm,
slight nuance in my perspective, but a
yeah,
facilitator is just guiding the folks versus saying being more directive, I guess.
yeah. And maybe being impacted by the big word leadership on the screen behind you. It almost sounds as if the trainer is the equivalent to a manager and the facilitator is the equivalent to the leader.
I would love that analogy. Perfectly said. Perfectly said. Yes.
Um, Wonderful. And then, and now I lost it. Um, so fascinated by my analogy that now yes, sorry. I'm so fascinated by the analogy. And what I actually would be curious about is what have you learned from software development about
Mm.
facilitation?
It was interesting because the particular software I use now, and now to completely and utterly date myself for those who are watching or learning, this was in the mid 90s before Windows was a thing. So it was DOS-based software. If you're listening, you don't know what DOS is, Google it and see you now have Google. But the software was actually it was for smaller banks and credit unions here in the US. And it was basically a precursor to CRM software, like a
Mm,
Salesforce kind of thing, but in a very, very pared down sort of way. So it was kind of fascinating because while we were teaching people how to push the right buttons to use this financial marketing software, we were then on the other side of it saying, like, great, you know how to push this report, but now what do you do with it? How do you creatively use the data? And I
mm,
think that was the kind of fun nuance bridge from being, the technical trainer to being more the soft skills trainer was broader application of the learning that they were doing. And it was just a really amazing experience. Talk about a great serendipitous moment when you're just starting your career to be into this space and then couple it with a small entrepreneurial, literally, of course, created in the garage of the two founders who were still the CEOs, 100 people in the company. The height of the tech was just starting to be a thing. And I'm still friends with the vast majority of the people from that company to this day. We have our own little Facebook group, and it was a lightning in a bottle team kind of a cohesion thing that
yeah,
happened.
yeah. And what I also hear is this acknowledgement. So when you describe the switch, is the acknowledgement that the people know already a lot. So
Hmm.
it's for them to empower them to find out and to find the curiosity to then do stuff with the data and not
Yes.
just give them the structure.
Correct. Yes. We weren't just like a living tutorial. We were, and that's where people would say, "Oh, you teach people how to push the buttons." I'm like, "Yes, and." It's more the strategic piece, and that's really, when I look back at my experience as a consultant, that's where it started. Is being able to ask the right questions. Sure, I can teach you the tool how to push a button or how to give proper feedback, but it's the why, it's the how, it's the impact that I think is
Mhm.
is really what makes it more of an art versus a science.
Oh yeah, beautiful. Yes, and more of a dance.
Mm,
Yeah.
yes.
And where do you, I'm fascinated by this distinction, especially if someone wears several hats of the consultant, the facilitator, the trainer, the coach, the guide, as you mentioned. And I wonder where the leadership piece comes. So for me, as you described as well, the facilitator is someone who acknowledged the know-how of the group. They empower them to find the answers themselves instead of giving them a prescription, which is not what a consultant does.
It depends on the consultant, quite frankly. And I have, in my career, I've also been a professional consultant. I was with a very, very, very large firm for several years. And what I saw was there's a difference and a nuance between consultants who really want to help people figure out the solution and those who want to help them figure out the solution because I already know what the solution is and I can sell it to you, kind of mentality. And so I think, the consulting that I tried to do, and I was in change management, which is such a gorgeous summary of how everything kind of works. And in a change consulting perspective, it is all about the questions. And I think to this day, that's what I still rely on. I actually had somebody in one of my leadership classes recently asking, like, how did you get to be, they said, good at this? I said, you know what? Part of my master's is in counseling psychology, and you just learn to listen and ask, and don't tell. And they're like, oh, that's a good idea. I said, that's kind of effective leadership, really. If you're a smart leader, you're listening and asking a lot of questions instead of like telling people, here's what you should do to solve your own problems.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Since everyone loves to be told what to do anyway.
Yes, so effective. So effective.
What makes a good question for you?
That beautiful open-endedness of the right questions. And in some of the work that I do and in my books and such, I wonderfully I'm former Disney as well. We never said we stole things, we repurposed them. And I repurposed some really great questions. And one of my favorite questions that I ask my students and my team members all the time is, if you're saying yes to that, what are you saying no to? Because I think so often than not, many folks are just like, yes, sure, I'll do it. Yes, sure, I'll do it. Yes, sure, I'll do it. And then now they have this massive plate of things and they're struggling to figure out prioritization. And so asking you, hey, that's great, you're going to do that, but what are you giving up? I think really stops people and makes them think about priorities and where the biggest impact is happening.
I love that example. And it reminds me of a coaching call I had recently. And my coachee was very proud of having received an offer for a retainer. Oh,
Nice.
my client wants to already block my time for all these sessions in the next year. So I'm sorted. And we're like, oh, what are the opportunity costs? And what about the inflation rate? And do you really want to lock your rates in for that long? So suddenly the discussion was, what are you saying no to if you say yes to a retainer?
And I've had my business Top Dog Learning Group for, it's actually, we can talk about that if you want. Started as a side hustle in 2002 while I was still at the Walt Disney Company, and then kind of kept it as this little thing burning in the back burner, and then took it full time in 2008, which of course, if you remember the global economy, was a really bad time to start a business. But to that point, I mean, as you go through running your own business and figuring things out, and as the markets ebb and flow and all that good stuff, you start to understand things like exactly what you just said. Like, ooh, well, if I take this client and I'm only going to get this much money, but now that's my time's focus, what am I missing out over here? And kind of having those conversations with yourself, or if you have a team or whatever it looks like.
Yeah. And then especially if you're passionate about what you do and when you're starting out. So I think at the beginning, and this was the case for me, so I was still in the scarcity mindset. So, oh, will there be enough?
Yep.
And then I was so passionate. So of course I want to do it all. And suddenly I was only working and forgetting about my private life.
Exactly.
Because that's at the end very often what we say no to.
Yeah. Yep.
If we don't pay attention. So going from Disney to your own company and Top Dog Learning Group.
Yes.
Why Top Dog?
So
And what were
I
people
was
learning?
Yeah, a lot of people are like, "Do you teach dogs?" I'm like, "Only my own, thank you. I teach humans." No, when I was at Disney, I was shadowing what ended up becoming my mentor and still one of my best friends to this day, Ruth. And she was moving on, so I was taking over her job, and I specifically worked for Disney Cruise Line and worked as an internal leadership consultant. So I would go on board the ships, go on Disney's Island, and teach people leadership things and all sorts of fun stuff. And it was a really sweet gig. But we're on one of my first voyages. Ruth kind of looks at me. She's like, "We need to have dinner." I'm like, "Well, we're gonna have dinner on a ship for 7 days together." She's like, "Okay." So we end up going to the spa, which was just a weird place to kind of have a business meeting. But there's that. It's co-ed. It's fine.
You
So
will
we're
be
sitting in
very
one of the
transparent.
very transparent.
Mask,
Yeah.
no
So it's
masks
just
allowed.
yeah, we're just sitting there in our swimsuits in the dry sauna or whatever. And she's like, "We should start a company." I'm like, "We have jobs." She's like, "No, no, no. Together, we're the perfect chief learning officer." I'm like, because she was further in her career. She was kind of had some really great gigs. She was, as she said at the time, moving down the corporate ladder as I was moving up.
Mhm.
And so we kind of noodled over it. And we went to our senior VP of HR, told her the deal. She's like, "First of all, thank you for sharing this. Don't use Disney stuff. Don't use Disney time. Good luck." And we're like, "Yay." So we kind of went on our way and did this side hustle. And we would meet like once a week and drink some wine and say, "Yay, we're going to conquer the training world." And this went on for several years. And we had a couple of client gigs here and there. It was fun. Ruth actually ended up going back up the ladder. She retired from Disney as a very, very, very high up senior VP and for the whole Walt Disney Company and lived in California. It was really great. I left Disney and then started doing some other things. I finished my doctorate, did the consulting with the big firm for a while, was a professor for like a hot minute and it didn't really stick with me. But I always kept this side hustle kind of in the back burner. We would do things once in a while. And then late 2007, I'll be completely transparent and honest, I got fired from my last corporate job. I still don't know why to this day. I live in the state of Florida here in the US. It's what's called a right to work state. If as long as it's not a protected class thing like race, ethnicity, gender, physical ability, you can fire somebody like, "Oh, you have a yellow shirt, Miriam. Thank you for staying. Goodbye." That's completely legal. And there's other states like that. It's very weird. So I got let go from this last corporate job. And I'm like, "Well, what the heck am I going to do now?" And so I did start looking for other full-time gigs. And I realized, hey, I have this whole business structure as a part-time thing. Let's flip the switch and make it full-time and just see what happens. And that's actually how I ended up doing Top Dog Learning Group as the full-time gig. And the name came about because Ruth's last name is Bond, my last name is Yacovelli, and we're like Bond and Yacovelli Associates. That sounds really stuffy, and we are very not stuffy people. We both like dogs. I didn't even own a dog at the time, and she's like, "Well, you like dogs?" I'm like, "I do." And she had this beautiful chocolate lab at the time, and we just came up with Top Dog, and it just stuck.
Wow. For leadership training.
Exactly. But yes, do definitely have to clarify when it's teaching humans versus teaching dogs.
And do you think this is because it can go in both directions, right? It can either trigger curiosity and be a door opener because everyone will ask, so top dogs, are you training dogs?
Yeah.
Um, or it can just close doors because people don't ask and then we'll
Yeah.
never learn.
I found it to be insanely beneficial branding wise because,
Mm.
I'd go to a lot of learning conferences and after a while people are like, "Oh, you're the dog guy." And that's all they remember. I'm like, you know what? That's good enough. They knew I was at a learning conference and there was a dog thing there. Fantastic. And then if you're watching, you're seeing on the video, my personal brand is the gay leadership dude. And that there's a whole story behind that. So now between the two brands working together, Top Dog is the business that includes my team. The gay leadership dude is just personally me, and that's what I do a lot of my keynotes under, and etc. The branding has worked quite well over the almost 17 years or so.
Interesting. And I would love to hear more about the reasons why you decided to call yourself the gay leadership dude. Very provocative. And
Yeah.
I can perfectly see that with the two brands. I do similar things. So I have my company workshops work
Mhm.
for clients. That's how I sign contracts and I send invoices. And then I have all the community work, which is never done before.
Yep. Yep.
And at some point I thought, if if I want to be hired by a client for a serious kind of training program or agency work, maybe they don't want to work with Never Done Before for the global trainee program.
It sends a different message, yeah. Well, and I was purposely, well, we purposely used group because then we could have affiliates underneath us, and that's actually what we do. Because the way my business runs is I have a handful of amazing consultants. I call them top doggers, but they have their own businesses as well. So they do 1099 subcontracting work. Some of them have their own LLCs. Some of them are just independent. And so technically, the Gay Leadership Dude is a part of the Top Dog Learning group, as is my friend Lori's communications company and my friend Leslie, who does international training and development. And so it actually works really nicely that we can kind of ebb and flow within the group, and people can engage or not as much as they need to, or the engagement for the client partner needs. It's actually, and I didn't fully plan them when I said group, we just kind of did that, and it serendipitously worked gorgeously. So we kind of, I have some graphics that show like, here's the umbrella of the Top Dog group, and then here's all the sub brands underneath it, or the people who are affiliated with us, and it's just really nice. It shows community, and I really love that part of it.
And before we talk about the dude as part of the group, I would be curious also because I also work with associates, and I think there are more facilitators also thinking of, okay, so I have maybe more gigs that I can serve. Maybe I can delegate, outsource. So what is for you, what made you do this shift, and what has been your biggest learning? And I'm thinking of quality assurance, alignment between the branding, culture, all these kind of things, with people who have other businesses as well.
It's been a really great learning experience. Truth be told, I really didn't branch out beyond just me doing the gigs until about 2017. I had just this big epiphany and I was doing quite fine. I had some really big contracts, was making, I was doing fine. It was me just doing all the training, and, I had some assistants in the back of house kind of stuff, but that was it. And I just had this big aha moment where I wanted to make, to paraphrase Steve Jobs, I want to make a bigger ding in the universe. And I realized that I couldn't do that with just me. And so if I was going to really branch out and really create more inclusive leadership and change management and diversity, equity, inclusion stuff, and all the other cool things I wanted to play with, I needed to start to trust others and delegate tasks. And, side note, I'm sure for those listening, if you teach anything around leadership, the whole concept of leadership courage and delegation and trust and all that fun stuff are all wrapped around gorgeously. So it started with people who I was already working with as subcontractors for another company. So I saw them, I knew them, I trusted them. There was two of them, and I'm like, I trust you. You could easily do this job because I literally sat in a classroom with you for 3 days all around the globe, and I know your caliber and quality. So that was like a no-brainer. And then one of my other consultants who joined, who's of course still with us, was a former client. And she's like, you know what? I've obviously seen you in action. You've seen me in action. I kind of want to stop doing the big corporate thing and kind of do work for you. Is that okay? I'm like, sure, that sounds fun. So I've just been really, really fortunate and blessed about this network of people who I trust with them, and I give them some brand standards about, here's how you use the logo. Here's when whenever we do a class, whether it's a virtual or in person, there is always music playing, because my pet peeve is walking to a training space that's completely dead silent. I think that's so horrible and uncomfortable, and that just sets an unconscious. Yeah. So like that's one of the stupid little pet peeves. They make fun of me. I'm like, you always have music, even in the virtual classroom. They're like, we got you.
Especially virtually. Yes, yes, yes. I
Yes.
agree.
It's just, we have like the pre-loops like you have at the movie theaters when we do our virtual stuff. That's just like, welcome, happy to see you. You should be hearing things. And it just like keeps rolling around and little things like that. And then the content wise, it still mainly goes through me as the filter. As the bottleneck, because visually we are a bit different than some of our contemporaries, just the way we approach visual storytelling in relationship to training, virtual or in person. And so that's still the bottleneck for me, although my amazing assistant, she's really good at it too. So she's doing more and more, which I love. But just fostering that sense of trust and quality. And once in a while, I'll bop into a virtual classroom with my team members and be like, I'm not here to check up on you. I'm just kind of curious to see how things are going. And they're like, okay. And they know I'm not like micromanaging. It's just like, I just want to see how you're doing it, because maybe we're doing things slightly differently. And in our monthly check-ins, we can share those differences and best practices.
Yeah. Yeah. So this means that they have their own, so you supervise the content, but it's not your content that they're delivering.
No, it's usually top dogs created content. So it'd be
Yeah.
myself or actually Ruth, who I mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
She's retired, but sometimes she's a great instructional designer. I'm like, can I coax you to do? She's like, okay, fine. So
Mhm.
she'll help me create things. We'll collaborate with that, and then once it's signed off on, we like it. This is where it's going. Then if it's an off the shelf solution, then the rest of the team gets it if they're the ones delivering it, and there's the full script. And I mean, obviously, like with any training, anyone listening, you get a script, but you still make it your own, that nuance. But there's this the pretty solid way to do it, and we empower our folks to do that, to make it their own. But here's kind of the very strong guides.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for clarifying this. And I totally agree. I think it's important to have your quality standards so that the content comes from you, because that's what your clients are expecting and buying. And then I think, and that's also where the facilitation, the leadership comes in. If you're not making it your own, you won't touch the participants, the audience. And
Yes.
you need to move and to touch them. And this is only through this personal touch.
Yeah.
Um,
100%.
and still, and I think and that's an art. How can you keep the personal touch and authenticity of your associates while still assuring that it has top dog
Hmm.
flavor, like the music,
Yeah,
the
it's a
little
great
thing.
question. Absolutely. What we've learned to do over the years is, in the leader script, and the way we approach it is, the leader script is, if you have a slide behind you and you completely fall asleep, you know what you should have been saying on that slide.
Mhm.
So, but what we do is we'll bake in, hey, here's a story. Like, it might be, hey, here's a story that Steve will personally use. Feel free to insert your own. But
Mm.
then we're not leaving somebody in the lurch, like they're, because some of our consultants haven't led massive teams. They've only led smaller teams. I've had the pleasure of doing both. So I'll say, hey, here's an example of when I worked for a large Fortune 500 and led a team of 35 people. And I said, if you have the experience, put in your own. If not, you can adjust this story to meet your needs, to help the learner understand the learning. And we just kind of leave that free flow, professional, I guess, decision making up to each facilitator.
Yeah, makes total sense. Um, and what makes a good facilitator for you? Before we move on.
It's a great question. When we look for our top dog talent, if you will, it's a combination of things. One is, we're very playful. I mean, you can figure that out in the name alone. And so we want people who they don't have to be my personality type. Absolutely not. I love the diversity of perspective, but to have that playful nature, to be a bit more upbeat. One company I work with, they're like, your team just has a sparkle. And I'm like, what does that mean? But that's kind of the phrase that we go to. There's just that little something extra. I think maybe it's that former Disney background I kind of have and gravitated toward, or whatever that is. But that's part of the things. There's just that engaging nuance and comfort. Some of the topics we do, like when we talk about inclusive leadership, they can get pretty heavy, and we can make people uncomfortable. And so somebody who has that caring, empathetic attitude, who can guide the learner through that, is someone who we absolutely cherish. Obviously, knowledge, experience. It doesn't have to be like 80 years of corporate experience, but having some. I mean, that's understanding the context of our learners. We do have a lot of nonprofits we work with as well, so that's fine. But being able to adapt and listen and work with our client partners to understand we use the term, their context. So
Mm.
it may not be, oh, you're a pharma client and I used to spend all my time in banking, but you can transfer the experience from one space to another. We absolutely are industry agnostic, I like to say.
Mhm.
We don't sit in one spot. I know some other training companies do, and that's fine. But we don't. So we can kind of pull those threads, like, oh, that's funny you say that, participant, because in my nonprofit group I was playing with the other day, and to kind of and build those bridges. And I think that's the last big thing we look for, is that ability to meet the learners where they're at, given their experience, their context, their level of sophistication,
Mm.
given whatever topic we're playing around with, and not make them feel that they're being taught to, that where they're being given tools and it's up to them to figure out what they want to do with them.
Yeah. Yeah. Important point, especially if you're working with leaders, right? Um,
Yeah.
they they know their stuff. They've come a long way. So they don't need a trainer to tell them what to do or
Yep.
what to think or what's right or wrong.
Yep. Yeah, we are very, very adamant about acknowledging the existing experience and
Mm.
expertise in the room, but say, hey, we're just going to give you some other stuff, have these conversations. You do with it what you will. And that approach has really lent itself well to our client base, especially when we're having conversations with the more senior folks, because we're like, hey, you probably heard all these things before. Maybe you've enacted them, maybe you haven't. We're still going to revisit the conversation and just see where it goes. And they're like, okay. And you can see like there, because you and anyone listening, anyone watching, who is voluntold to be in some of your sessions. They're sitting in the back, their arms are crossed, looks like they just ate a lemon. And winning those folks over by being empathetic, putting yourself in their situation, and is to me a very, very, very high skill set for any good facilitator.
Yeah. Yeah, and acknowledging that it's okay not wanting to be there.
Yeah.
This is very disarming usually. Just saying, okay, I understand that you have other stuff to do. This is not your priority. That's okay. Give me a chance.
I
You
love
wanna
when we
be-
do our, because we've turned, of course, all of our content into virtual content as of kind of toward the end of 2020. Now, as you and I have talked, Miriam, my doctorate's in instructional technology and distance education. So
Mm.
oddly enough, when the pandemic happened, I was kind of in a good position knowing how to turn things in virtual. Yeah. So we did some cool stuff. And we turned a lot of our, 2-day in-person content into multi-module, 4-hour Zoom and other tools chunks. And when we first rolled that out to clients, we're like, 4 hours of Zoom, I'm like, trust me, it
Mm.
is not boring. There's always a break every hour. It's very experiential, like we would do in the classroom. And so every time we roll out a program and we have new students come in, and we'll ask them, was this what you expected? And they're like, oh, hell no. We're like, what? Like, no, in a good way. Like, oh, okay, good. So really being able to kind of turn that experience, regardless of the delivery channel, is also something we look for as well.
Yeah, yeah. And I agree. You can turn Zoom meetings into deep experiences. And I think especially, and that's maybe then the bridge to the inclusive leadership topic, um, especially for difficult conversations. Because in a breakout, nobody listens. Everyone has the same chance to be matched with anyone else. So it's
Yeah.
very democratic. And it's very intimate because you're so
Yes.
close to each other that in the normal circumstances, you wouldn't be so close.
I, in breakout rooms in a physical room are great, but you're absolutely right. There's something a little bit more private about that breakout room. And sometimes, because I always bounce around from room to room, just kind of eavesdrop for a little bit, like I would in a physical
Oh,
classroom.
really? Oh,
Oh, absolutely.
interesting.
I'll
Okay.
ease what I've learned to do though is with the software that I use, for if you're watching, you're seeing my green screen. These are just exactly how I would present a class or a virtual keynote or whatever. Is I have my slides behind me, but I can make them bigger, like I'm doing here, and then I can disappear. And then so when I bop into the room, it's just my slide. And
Mm.
now I acknowledge the people that I'm in the room, just so you know, but sometimes they don't even think about it. And it's just so much nicer than me like physically being like, hi, I'm here. And it's and people are like, and sometimes they call me Dr. Steve, like, Dr. Steve, are you there? And I won't say anything, but I'll just use an emoji that like clapping or something like that. And like, oh, okay. And then if I have to, I might get in the chat and be like, carry on, just ignore me. And they do. And it's really just interesting to hear those intimate conversations while they're having versus in a bigger space in a physical arena.
And it's interesting because I, and that's something that I announce in advance that I and my associates I work with, we guarantee that we never go into a breakout room.
Mm,
Because I believe, okay, you're all adults, you know what you want to discuss, and our questions are invitations that you might discuss in the breakout room. If you consider something more important, who am I to judge?
yeah, oh,
Um,
absolutely.
and then I would fear that if so, if I was in a very deep conversation, especially if it's vulnerable, how would I react if someone then stands there? But it might be different if for different contexts, or when it's really training where you want them to
Yeah.
Train certain skills.
I've in our experience, I found it to be really beneficial because I try to not do pairs, only because in my experience over the almost 30 years doing this, pairs can be so personality driven, that when you have 3 people, it's a little bit less intimate in not a bad way, especially if I have a limited amount of time. You could still foster trust with 3 folks versus 2 without it being super vulnerable and weird.
Yeah.
And so I've found that has worked well.
Yeah. And to +1 this the trios, when you have 2, it's very easy to cheat, in air quotes, or let's do something else. But if there are 3, there's always a kind of an accountability person who's like, yeah, but we should do something else. So if there are
Steve said.
trios, they rather stick to the rules.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, to your exact point though, this is adult learning, friends. If they want to go down and talk about something, I don't care. I mean, this is their time. I'm here to make that space. They do with it what they will. But I've found that, especially in the way we tee up our virtual classrooms, you know, we have the slide that has here's the questions that you prompt to do and go have fun, friends. And what I've loved is when we come back from the breakouts, if I've gone to, I try to go to at least a moment in each room if I can. And selfishly too, it's just really fascinating to hear people's perspectives. I love it. And for the debrief, you know, one of the things that I or my team will say is, you know, what did you hear that was interesting? And just kind of let it sit and see where things go. And sometimes people will say, oh, here's what I said, or my partner said this, and I'm totally going to volunteer them. And people laugh and stuff like that. And if I have to, I might say, well, you know, I won't say which room, but I heard this comment I thought was so fascinating. How do you all react to it? And it just really keeps that conversational approach to whatever topic moving.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. And what makes a workshop fail for you?
I really, really, really am adamant about compulsory training. I just, at the adult learning level, I don't think that's smart. Now, if you're trying to do a tick box mentality, fine, I get it. You sometimes have to, depending on where you sit in the world and those legal things and blah, blah, blah. But like for all of our leadership training that we do, and we have a lot of off-the-shelf stuff, and we sometimes will create custom content for our client partner. But for our things, we'll have the conversation, well, who do you think this is good for? And yeah, we can get very, you know, I say, well, if it's a cohort of, you know, executives, the content's fine. It's the conversation that will be nuanced and different. If you're talking about, you know, entry to mid-level leaders, yeah, that's fine too. The content's still fine. The conversations might be different. But we go into it and say, you know, we define leaders anyone with influence in the business, period. And they're like, oh, so an individual contributor? I'm like, absolutely. Matter of fact, even more so because they don't have formal power. So let's tell them those skills and tools that they can use when they don't have those solid lines in the org chart.
Yes.
But when I find, especially with the inclusive leadership programming we do, when people are voluntold to go, it's just a harder lift on our side. And yes, you know, most of the time we can still win them over. It's you know, a lot more challenging. But if people go into it with the open mind that, oh, I'm here to make myself better and to further my career, oh, that makes or breaks a class.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love that you underline the leaders without formal authority. They're so important. A change manager, a project manager, a product owner, they have so much impact, and because they facilitate
Absolutely. Traffic cops.
processes. They're in touch with so many stakeholders, and they really do need the leadership skills and the
Yeah.
facilitation skills.
Yeah. 100%.
So, what is your definition of inclusive leadership? And what does inclusivity mean beyond the buzzword? Because it can mean so many things. And there can be very little behind.
I love that you asked this question. And one of the things that we're seeing, and I think this is a global, sadly, a global trend, is 2020, Black Lives Matter. You saw this massive focus on diversity, equity, inclusion in the workplace. Fantastic, love it. Now you're seeing some pushback on that, and now the concept of diversity, equity, inclusion is going away, or at least it's less important, it seems. And I'm seeing that with just proposals, like actual proposals for work, and people are like, oh, we're gonna hold off. We're like, oh, it's when we need it the most. But to me, smart, inclusive leadership within a workplace context is empowering leaders to create a sense of belonging for everyone, period. So that could be my coworker of color. That could be the queer employee that's on my team. That could be the parent who is looking at the world differently because they have a kid. And
Mhm.
so when we have the conversation about defining diversity in and of itself in the work that we do, we use this, and actually, of course, if you're watching, I happen to have slides, of course. But there's this amazing model called The Five Layers of Diversity by Garden, Schwartz, and Rowe, two amazing pioneers in diversity, equity, inclusion space. I've actually had the pleasure of knowing, Facebook friends with them. They're awesome. But their idea was, when you say diversity, a lot of companies, a lot of organizations go to what they call the internal dimensions. And so just to kind of, so if you're listening but not watching, picture a bullseye with five rings. There's a tiny center, and it kind of works your way out just like you're playing darts or something. And in the very dead center, where the bullseye would be, is, according to Garden, Schwartz, and Rowe, what they call personality. So if you think about it, and we are all five of these layers, of course, but what makes you, whoever's listening or watching, is your personality. There will never be another Miriam. There will never be another Steve, because of who we are and our personality. So that's part of your uniqueness. And then the next layer out is what they call the internal dimensions. And now this is the one that everybody goes to. Oh yeah, we have blank month. And that's things like gender, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, physical ability. And these are the ones that kind of don't change. There's a little asterisk on a few of these, but they don't change pretty much over the course of your life. This is the one where people, when I'm starting to work with clients, especially in a consulting perspective, and say, would you consider yourself inclusive? Like, oh, of course we are. We have blank month. It's like, okay, that's a good start, but that's pretty minimal when it comes to the definition of diversity. And then Gard, Schwartz, and Rowe say the next layer out, that third layer, is identified with their external dimensions. And these are things that can change often very daily. Things like my physical appearance, my work experience, my educational background, my religion, income, geographic location, parental status. Those are things that are different and can be very malleable over our lifetime, but they always impact how we look at the world. And
Mm.
then the next layer out, the fourth out of five, is organizational dimensions. So in the context of your whatever group you're part of, where do you sit? What's your division, your seniority, your physical office location, management status. I actually added the term legacy organization because I started working with a lot of companies that you have mergers and acquisitions, and you'd hear them
Mhm.
say, oh, your former blank, blank, blank company. And having that mentality of like this otherness and how that impacted where they sit now. And so organizational dimensions, oh, you're in accounting, so you must look at the world this way versus our sales friends. Yeah, that actually does impact the way you look at the world, especially in the context. And then they added this fifth layer not too long ago, and they call it your country of operation. And so it's where you physically operate out of permeates or impacts how you look at the world, political systems, laws, the business etiquette. I do a lot of work with German-based multinational companies. I don't know why. I don't speak German, just kind of happened. But you can see how that country of operation permeates throughout the workplace culture, whether we like it or not. And so when we go into a company and when we go into an organization and we talk about inclusive leadership, we go very well beyond internal dimensions of race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, physical ability. And we do all of these. And
Mm.
what it does is a couple things. It helps people understand that every single human is diverse. And they don't, a lot of times people don't think that way, especially if you in some instances sit in the majority. But if I talk about handedness, for example, which is probably falls into, it could be more so the internal dimensions, I would think. It's not listed there. But if I think about it, like I'm right-handed, but I know a lot of left-handed people.
Mm.
And they constantly talk about how their world experience is different being a left-handed person, which is like 12% of the global population. Sometimes there's tools, gadgets that aren't meant for left-handed people. I remember as a kid going into classrooms and there'd be like that one left-handed desk that all the left-handed kids would fight for because it was on the opposite side and they would have to crane their poor little arms away, to write on the right-hand desk. So like things like that help people understand we are all diverse, and creating that sense of belonging and inclusion for everybody doesn't have to just go to those internal dimensions. It goes well beyond that. And that's really where we start the conversation of inclusive leadership.
I love that. Thank you for also taking the time
Yeah,
to walk us through the
you're welcome.
model. And would I be curious, what are the small things, and you spoke before about the small things that you do different, that create an atmosphere of inclusivity? And I'm thinking of, we had a conversation earlier this week about safe space and how I cringe when someone say, "Oh, this is a safe space." I
Is
mean,
it?
don't tell me that it's a safe space. It's something that I need to feel, right?
100%. Yep.
And I think with inclusivity, it's the same. Oh, we are inclusive. But
Are you, Jen?
are you really? And does everyone really feel included? And how about the
Yeah.
inclusivity of the traits that you don't see?
Yep.
And they're actually a lot. And I think I've spoken to a white, middle-aged, cisgender man, and he was explaining from what background he came, very tough life, very
Mm.
difficult childhood upbringing, years in therapy. And he's like, and everyone treats me as if I was this privileged dude.
Yeah.
And hell,
Yeah.
I'm not. And I just want to shout at them, but I mean, you cannot. So
Right. Right.
how do you deal with this part of inclusivity?
Yeah. And that's why this model is, I mean, I obviously I get no kickback. I love Lee and Anita who created it. But to me, it really frames it up well so that when in all of our workshops, we go through this definition very early on. And it's so people understand, like that white cisgendered man, that you know what? That's one, like those are just a couple facets of the 50 I've just described. And so when we talk about, educational background or socioeconomic upbringing, which are part of that, absolutely those factor in. Now, it's not to undermine the experience of, say, someone who is a person of color versus someone who's not. Absolutely not. That's not what I'm saying. Please understand that and be crystal clear. But I think some people get way too in the weeds of what is quote unquote diversity and
Mhm.
don't really think about it from a broader perspective that we are all diverse because we are all unique. Yes, you at times will be in the majority, at times you'll be in the minority or the in and the out group, as people have to say. But a smart, inclusive leader understands those nuances and makes sure that everyone has that feeling of belonging to the workplace. And that's what I do love about this work is it's getting less about diversity or inclusion and flipping the script and saying, hey, participant in the culture, do you feel like you belong? And
Mm,
in the case of that particular gentleman you just said, he might say no. And then if I'm an inclusive leader, I need to say, okay, what can I do to make you feel that sense of belonging? And
mm,
that's the difference that we try to get to.
yeah. So what are the small things a leader can do to create the sense of belonging?
I think it's just being, and we talk a lot about mindful meditation within all the programs we do, but it's just being able to get out of your own head and be open to the feedback on when maybe you're not looking at things as inclusive as you can be. In my book, Pride Leadership, we talk about the drone perspective. You get into your drone, you kind of hover above yourself, and you kind of watch yourself, how you're acting, saying, feeling, and say, "Ooh, is that being as inclusive?" And being open to that feedback. And I think if I were to pin down what makes a workplace culture inclusive, or what's one of the foundational pieces of inclusive culture, it's a feedback rich culture. It's
Mm,
a space where people say, you know what? I'm going to share with you what I just saw in a respectful way, not to ding you down or make myself feel better, but to be like, hey, I heard you say this, and it may have been perceived as this way, or I perceived it as this way. And that recipient of that feedback being like, oh my gosh, thank you for sharing that perspective, and then moving on,
mm,
hopefully doing something with it. And
yeah.
that to me is really a fundamental of changing how we create those senses of belonging within our workplaces.
Mm. Thank you. I love that it's almost like a triangle where one piece is the belonging piece, which is psychological safety. We need to feel safe. And
Absolutely.
then we feel belonging. And then the inclusion and the recognition of all the different facets. And then, yeah, having the difficult conversations for which you need both. You need the psychological safety to actually be able to have these difficult conversations, and you need the awareness um, of the diversity, because there's also a diversity in how we will be open to receive feedback. Because I think if you
Absolutely.
have grown up as a marginalized person, um, then every critical, constructive feedback is, yeah, is perceived as a potential threat, or can be
Yeah.
perceived.
But if we're creating a workplace where we say, you know what, we want people to provide that feedback, we want you to be open to it, and we want you to do something about it. Now we're making a statement within our workplace, like that's the expectation. And moving forward, let's hold each other accountable for that expectation. And I think that's where I'm seeing a lot of changes happen, is when leaders get beyond the tick box performative allyship mentality, like, yay, it's Pride Month, let's rainbow wash everything, and then July 1st, it's back to the regular logo. It's the ones who are weaving those conversations throughout, big and small. I have a great story for you. I was working with a client, and we were having this conversation about what can you do to foster inclusivity with all those layers. And she said, what's really interesting, we just changed our HR bereavement policy to include non-human family members. And I got goosebumps the first time I heard it. Now, truth be told, I'm married. I'm a husband of 25 years. We do not have human children, but we have canine children. And she said that, and I'm like, I just felt seen as a parent. Because I mean, I'm not saying that my dogs are equitable to a human child, but do I love them? Heck yeah. And when my canine daughter, passed, do you think I didn't feel that for months and months and months? Of course I did. And so when she said that, I was like, I feel absolutely seen and belonging. And I'm not even part of your workplace. And
Mm.
that's one you wouldn't even think about. But what else can we do besides the big things versus the smaller things that really can make a huge difference in our workplace?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. Um, and I can see if your pets, if your dogs then need to go to the doctor, yes, you need to take time for that. You might be
Yeah.
absent at work. You might be less flexible. Um, Interesting. I haven't looked at it like that. And you mentioned pride, and I saw on your website that you're also doing pride leadership training.
Yep. Yes.
And
It's
what
behind my.
is, oh, you wrote a book about pride leadership. So
I
what
did.
is pride leadership? And let me be very maybe provocative. To what extent is it important to speak about sexuality that is something very personal at the
Mhm.
workplace? So where's the connection to leadership?
So I was at a conference in 2018, and I was in between sessions. I was sorting my business cards. There was a woman kind of sitting next to me, waiting to go in another session, doing the exact same thing. And she's like, "What do you do?" I said, "Oh, I'm a consultant, blah 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 blah." She's like, "Well, I'm a publisher." I'm like, there's a leadership book in my head. I've been doing this for so long. She's like, "Well, let's get that book out." And so that's actually Jen Grace from Publisher Purpose Press, still my publisher for my next book. Just met with her today. And so we started going down the path. I was getting kind of thoughts together on what does this leadership program or this leadership book look like. And do you remember the original Sex in the City show?
A long
So
time
this is like
ago.
like
Yeah.
20 ago, yeah, a long time ago. But if not, if you're listening, you're like, what the heck is he talking about? There's the main character. She was an author, a columnist, and every episode she opened up her MacBook and write, I couldn't help but wonder. And that was kind of like the thesis statement for whatever the topic of the conversation was in the episode. Well, as I'm kind of putting thoughts together for my generic leadership book, I started looking at my queer brothers and sisters and siblings who are doing advocacy work, working in different places, both here in Orlando, Florida, US, where I'm at, and as well as beyond. And the little Carrie Bradshaw, I couldn't help but wonder went off. And I said, I couldn't help but wonder if the 6 competencies that honestly I came up with that make or break any leader, queer or not. But
Mm.
if you put them through the rainbow lens, what do they look like? So if you're not watching, the 6 competencies are authenticity, courage, empathy, communication, relationships, and culture. And I
Mm.
would adamantly define that these 6 make or break any leader, period.
Yeah.
You have the Brene Browns of the world, for example, talking about being an authentic leader. Yes, absolutely. Now put that through the rainbow lens. And I talk about in Pride Leadership that you're already exercising these things a lot, whether you realize it consciously or unconsciously as a member of the LGBTQ plus, or I say PLU, community. So authenticity, for example, if I'm an out gay man at work, if I'm a trans person being my authentic self in the workplace, you're already practicing that power. And in Pride Leadership, I say, great, channel that power to be a more effective leader, period. And so these have been like the go-to competencies for any program we talk about. But in Pride Leadership, we dive deeper into the 6, also knowing that they are so not silos. I have to be courageous to be my authentic self.
Oh,
If I'm
yeah.
going to build relationships, I'm leveraging effective communication strategies among everything. And so it's just been this really amazing experience since we launched the book in
Mm.
2019, and then subsequent. And I created an online training program that uses the book as a textbook, and all these other things, all the keynotes and all that stuff, on having all these conversations about these 6 competencies and how they relate to your queerness collective experience, of course, or not, and what we can do to channel our energy to make those 6 more effective.
Thank you. Makes total sense. And then maybe also normalizing the experience of queer leaders or colleagues at work to speak about leadership.
Yeah. There's a getting back to the comments of psychological safety. And I see this so much when the Lions program, which is the online leadership program, a leader's immersive opportunity to nurture strengths. See, there's a whole branding thing, Lions and Pride, and yeah, anyway. But I mean, and we've been doing it since 2020. Hundreds and hundreds of leaders have gone through, and one of the big commonalities is folks saying, "I feel so safe here that I can really share my authentic self." I had someone just in a class the other day say, you know what? I actually prefer the pronouns they, them. I've never said that out loud before, but I feel I can say that here because I'm
Mm.
amongst other queer leaders. I'm like, absolutely, this is your spot. And it's not just, us doing it in this program. You have women leadership programs. You have people of color leadership programs. Are they different? Yes and no. But it's creating that safer space, because some of the nuances of the queer population are common. Statistically speaking, only half LGBTQ plus people are out at work in the US. Half. That
Wow.
stat still is holding true. It's wavering a few here and there, but overall, it's still about 50%. So for all the queer people that out at work in the US, half of them aren't, for whatever reason. So being able to create that space that people feel comfortable sharing their authentic self is really, really important. And I don't think most organizations are doing a good enough job for that.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you um yeah, underlining that. And how important or is it then to really open this conversation in an organization? Because, yeah, as I mentioned, it's for me, sexuality and religion are very personal things. Um, to what extent do they belong or not belong? And what are the pros and cons of normalizing it or talking about it in the workspace?
Yeah, if I go back to any of the facets of diversity that we talk about, I think being able to share those is super important, regardless of which ones you go with.
Mm.
If I'm a deeply religious person, I don't want to hide that facet of who I am and how I look at the world. Now, obviously, we have personal values and then workplace values, and we need to be mindful of their alignment or misalignment, and that's a whole other podcast conversation we could have.
Mm.
But overall, if I'm creating a workplace where people can bring their full selves to work,
Mm.
that's not limited. There's no asterisk on that.
Mhm.
Now within reason, of course, there might be some facets of my identity that probably shouldn't be brought into work, and we can go down that path in another way. But overall, I think, if I'm a deeply religious person, using that again as an example, why not? Why is that not embraced as part of my authentic self? Because studies show when I can bring my full self to work, I'm more productive, I'm contributing more, I'm more innovative, I'm more trusted. So that space should be created for everyone, regardless of if you're queer, you're straight, you're a parent, whatever.
Yeah, 100%. And yeah, I get it. So it's not even about making it a big thing and discussing it to death, but about showing that it is okay
Yes,
to show up however.
absolutely.
And then I think it's actually a very smart strategy to see how the pride values and strength actually
Mm,
show up in leadership in general, because this can then also create another level of conversation and build bridges. And
yeah.
I think there's a lot to learn from the LGBTQ plus community and their experience of coming out and having the courage to be their authentic selves.
Yeah, and yeah, we could go so far in this. I love it. But that's what I think is really fascinating about these six competencies. And I just didn't make these up. I actually had so many colleagues give me their input, like, what do you think makes a leader more successful in the workplace? And they all gave me all these things. And some of the words were a little bit different, but I pared them down. But the very first piece of feedback I had from my first editor for Pride Leadership, which of course is where these were introduced, she's like, okay, Steve, I am not your target audience. I'm a white cisgendered straight woman. I'm like, okay. She's like, this is the book I wanted when I was doing my MBA program. I'm like, what?
Mm.
She's like, because it's, I mean, I, as a nerd, as you well know, I, a lot of these models and concepts, they're not mine. I didn't invent this. I cite the right people. So I pull these threads all together through the six competency framework. And she's like, she's like, you need to de-gay the book. I'm like, no. I said, because one, that's disingenuous.
Gay,
Two, that's not
be
what I'm
gay.
talking. But yeah, so she said, and she said it half joking. And she's like, no, the next version, make it de-gay. I'm like, I'm not going to do that because, I don't want to focus my energy there. But I've had so many allies, straight allies, read the book and be part of the leadership program. And they're like, oh yeah, this totally resonated with me. I totally get it. So these are
Mm.
universal stuff.
Interesting. Would be interesting to see, are there straight um people signing then up for the Pride leadership?
Yeah.
Is it something
One
you
of
would
our,
see?
absolutely. It's one of our biggest populations that go through the Lions program are LGBTQ plus or plus employee resource groups. So if you're listening and not familiar, most major companies have affinity groups, employee resource groups, where it's like, here's the women's group, here's the veterans group, here's the queer group, here's the people of color group. And so it's like a way for employees to connect and foster relationships and network and all that stuff. And so what we've been doing is working with a lot of those LGBT employee resource groups, and they're filtering their global leaders through our program. Well, members of those employee resource groups don't have to be queer. There's a lot of allies who join for a
Mm.
variety of reasons. And so, through our relationship with a lot of these companies, straight people start going through it and they're like, we totally get it. This is totally fine. But they already have a little bit more openness to the LGBTQ plus experience for whatever
Yeah.
reason, that prompted them to join that gay business group. So they come in with a little bit more of an open mind, but they're like, yeah, this is just for gay folks. We get it too. I'm like, yay, that's how it should be.
Okay. With all the different work you do, what remains your number one facilitation challenge?
It's a great question. I think I love the intimacy of a classroom, whether that be 30, 50 people and myself, virtual or in person. But I'm doing more and more keynotes, which I love because it's a bigger audience that can hear my story, learn some things, some strategies to be more consciously inclusive, but it's just not as intimate. They just don't have that connectedness that I like. I tried to, but if it's, 700 people, 1,000 people, 3,000 people, most I had was 4,000 some, which is big, huge, but you don't connect as well that you do in a classroom. And I think that's probably one of my biggest frustrations. I know if I'm going to make that ding in the universe even bigger, it needs to be, the one to many, many, many. But
Mm.
I think there's a sacrifice to the, connectedness that I can do with the audience that way.
Mm. Are you using your facilitation skills in some form when you do public speaking or keynotes?
1,000%. Yeah, I warn all the event planners and folks I work with. I say, this is really a training class that I'll
Mm.
do. And like, there's always a workbook or a handout, and people are like, you have a handout? I'm like, absolutely. I want people to walk away with remembering some things and having the models or whatever I talk about. And one of my signature talks, we when we're trying to create a consciously inclusive workplace, is I have a 3-pronged model to think in, speak up, and act out. And so I want people to remember, what do I do now that I left Steve's keynote on how do I speak up on behalf of inclusivity within my workplace, for example. And so the event planners and folks are just like, oh, that's kind of cool. You're like giving them like a workbook that they can go play with. I'm like, yeah. So it is completely facilitation. It's just a little less of, like activities and such, but I only I got an hour or so. So that works out pretty well.
Nice. And it's very effective on many levels. So they have they have a nudge. So when they come home, then they will remember, oh, I promised myself that I will speak up and act out. Um, and it's also for your branding and business development. Oh, they have a nudge to
Yeah,
think
it helps.
of you, and oh, maybe I check out his courses, his book, or his other work.
And what we've also been doing as a value add, I'll tell, whoever's, our client partner, hey, 1 month from now, because the handout's there, people can do some self-learning, self-paced learning. I'll come back and do a Q&A or facilitate conversation like, hey, how did that work? You did the
Mm.
think and speak up, act out. What happened? What did you experience? And make it even more of a deeper learning than, when I worked at Disney, and I go on board the cruise ships and I do a ship dip. I go in, dip the crew in some topic and run away. That's not change management. That's not how you sustain human behavior change. But by doing a keynote and then coming back a month later, people have this unconscious accountability now. Like, oh shoot, Steve's going to ask me stuff. And so like, that's awesome. And how do we then weave in communication strategies? So whenever we do a learning program, I wrap it around a change management strategy. And I
Mm.
say, we can do all of it. We can do the communications, the executive sponsorship, the measurement strategy, absolutely all that. You asked for just training, but we can do more if you want sustained behavior change. And if you don't want us, that's totally fine. But these are the pieces that will make this less of a ship dip and more of a, we're changing our workplace culture.
Yeah. And what I hear is that any organizational learning program, so you want to shift from, or you want to bridge a knowledge gap, that's what learning is. If I understand you correctly, every learning program is a change program, because with new learning comes new behavior, comes new culture.
Yep. Yep. I remember when I first was really starting to understand that very early in my career, I was really big in like training, training, training. And my colleague who was doing the exact same job I was, she's like, no, it's performance management. I'm like, what? And, it's just helping me understand that, yeah, training is great, but what's the performance support that's going to underlie that to get them through that change and that dip? And then when I became a change consultant, I'm like, oh, I get it now.
Mm.
It's like I go to the gym once, I'm not fit. It's that sustained change in behavior, like, oh, how am I making sure I'm watching my calories and getting enough sleep and drinking enough water and all those other nuances that are beyond that one event, like a training event, that are really going to help change the behavior.
Yeah. And also how the awareness, how it will impact the entire thing. Because if it's just a training, then it's back to the tick the box
Yep.
kind of thing, where
Yep.
yes, you can say it's oh, we have informed our people about inclusivity and DI. We have trained them. We have done that. But to really have this impact and the change, especially when it's on an organizational level, there's more than just the training.
And I wrote an article several years ago on and the title was something to the effect of why diversity training programs fail.
Mm.
And
Tell
people are
us.
like, wait, isn't that what you do for a living? I'm like, yes, it is. And they will fail. And the whole conversation, of course, was around, humans need a lot more than just a ship dip in order to change behavior. And too many workplaces, even now, are still in that performative allyship, tick box mentality. Oh, inclusive. Hey, Steve came in, did inclusive training. Yay, we're there. No. What else is happening within the culture to sustain that change in behavior?
And what would be a good first step? So how do you create this speak up, act out mentality inside organizations?
What my first thought for folks is, how are you measuring success?
Mm.
And I've worked with so many training organizations, and they don't want to do measurement beyond the Kirkpatrick 2, maybe, and go beyond. I'm still a believer
What
in
is Kirkpatrick too?
if you're one of the many ways that people look at measuring the impact of training, Kirkpatrick's a training behavioralist, I think that he was, that started creating, okay, how do you measure the impact of learning? So level one is, learner reaction. You all listening to this know those smile sheets. This is a good use of my time.
Mm-hmm.
That's great. But what does that really tell you about the impact of the learning? So level two is knowledge transfer. Pre-test, post-test is the quintessential way to measure that. I didn't know something, I went to your training, now I know something, boom. Level three is where it gets better, in my opinion, anyway, because now we're talking about behavior change. It's one thing to
Mm.
know something. I know that this speed limit is this, but did I change my behavior because of it? Maybe, maybe not. But that's where we're starting to make that difference. And then, depending on which model of Kirkpatrick in the year, there's either 4 or 5. I'm still classic 4 levels. 4 is about the organization. What's the bottom line? How did that change the behavior? Now, for training like sales, it's pretty easy to figure out. It's like, did I increase my sales because now I learned this new method of selling? Awesome sauce. But if we're talking about, oh, here's a feedback model, here's leadership skills, how do you measure that? And it gets kind of squishy, but you can still do it, I argue. And so I think the first thing I say for organizations is, what does the measurement strategy look like? And what are the metrics both that you need to create and that exist that can give you an overall barometer of the change? For example, do you have an employee engagement survey that you do each year? And is
Mm.
there a question there that says, I feel that I belong in my workplace? My leader helps me feel safe. Whatever those are right questions. Yes, those are data points we could leverage. Yes, we're making a difference. And then it's other things like, I know one of my clients I work with is a very large restaurant chain. And so they have their call line that people can complain about, both a guest who's in the restaurant as well as employees. And one of the questions is, I feel like I've been biased behavior against me or whatever. Great. There's another key metric point. So I think it starts with the measurement and then kind of works its way out. Okay, if that's how we're going to measure success, how do we change that behavior? Yes, it could be communication strategy, training stuff. How are we managing our senior executives to support this change? Our middle managers, what does that look like? And so it's really a comprehensive approach versus the ship dip. Here's our training class, we're done.
Yeah, thank you. And then, so what are the small things one can do to speak up, act out?
So when we talk about that strategy, and you can't get too deep into it because it's my keynote, I'm not give the whole way. No, I'm just kidding. But really, it's really about think in is about you as a human. What are you doing to manage your own unconscious biases is really the big
Mm.
focus. Speak up is when you're given that opportunity where you hear someone say, for example, a disparaging remark about someone, women drive. That's a true story I'll share another time. Do I speak up and
Mm.
defend the rights of those others?
Yeah.
Don't engage in silent collusion. And then act out is, well, what else can we do? For example, am I putting what are my the pronouns I use in my email signature? What does that do? It normalizes things, and it lets folks express, if they aren't, what you would expect them to do from a pronoun perspective. That's a little thing, but that's an act out thing. The bereavement policy I shared earlier, that's an act out thing. What else are we doing in the workplace that can really show that all of us, those 5 layers again, are being seen and heard and felt and listened to and protected and honored within that respective workplace?
Thank you. And I think if someone has listened until now, they will hire you as a keynote speaker.
I hope so. That's the job.
Thank you. Almost spoke for 1.5 hours. Is there anything that you would have wanted to speak about that we haven't touched upon?
No, I think we hit all the main things. The only thing I would say in a wonderfully gorgeous self-promotion is my next book comes out, depending on when you listen to this or when you watch this. So Pride Leadership is about the leadership strategies, kind of going through the 6. The next book, called Your Queer Career, Workplace Advice from the Gay Leadership Dude, is applying those. So it's kind of like all questions I've been getting from folks like, dear gay leadership dude, I think my boss is homophobic. What do I do? And so in 1,200 words or less, I kind of answer what I would do in those situations and hopefully solve some potential common challenges both queer and straight people might have within the workplace.
And now that you mentioned this one question, so what can someone do if they have the impression that their boss is homophobic?
Yeah, I list a whole, and I'm a big fan of listicles. Like, try these 5 things, and so I have to remember what some of those were, but the first one was, are they really homophobic, or do you think they're homophobic? So kind of checking your own unconscious biases, human, and is that really the case? And then kind of doing some legwork, asking around, and if it really comes down to, yeah, they are kind of being jerks, then, what are some strategies you can do within your workplace to kind of address that potentially toxic situation?
Yeah, good one. Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you so much for this rich and, yeah, very insightful conversation.
I enjoyed it. It's always fun to share some things, especially with folks who are in the same profession as me, which I always love. It's kind of makes it a little bit more homey.
Yes. Oh, yes. And all the information will be in the show notes.
Yes, yes. Topdoglearning.biz, B-I-Z, is the easiest way to find me.
Yes.